All right, everybody, we're going to get started and we'll keep letting people in. Again, we're thrilled to have you here tonight. We're really looking forward to this programming. I am just going to be very brief. I'm Mielle Marquis with the School of Law and the Alumni Office of Alumni Relations and Development. I am going to turn it over to Michael Xavier in just 1 second. Michael has a long background, over 18 years in family law. He's a partner at Prince Lobel, and he's a member of the Alumni Association Board of Directors and the Community Building Committee. Michael, take it away.
Thank you, Mielle. I want to welcome you all to our program. I'm really excited to see many of you here virtually for our program, Not Just a Number, virtual book club on racial inequality. Presented to you tonight by the Alumni Association Board of Directors, our Community Building Committee, and the Office of Alumni Relations and Development. Our book tonight is Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents by Pulitzer Prize winning author Isabel Wilkerson. Again, my name is Michael Xavier. I'm one of the Board of Directors for the Northeastern Alumni. And my co-chair, Lee Darst, who is here with us today, my illustrious co-chair, we are the co-chairs of the Community Building Committee. And we have a great community here tonight, inside and outside the law school in the Northeastern community. So I'm thrilled to have you all. I want to thank you very much, Mielle, for putting this together, our Director of External Relations at the Office of Development and Alumni Relations. I thank you so much for your work and putting this all together. We're lucky to have with us tonight Professor Patricia Williams, who will lead our discussion, and we hope that you will all contribute to our discussion. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions and participate in what we hope will be a meaningful dialogue for all of us tonight. Before we get to our esteemed moderator of our discussion, I do want to tell you a little bit about the CRRJ, the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project at Northeastern Law School. It is a great initiative that was started by Margaret Burnham, and it is a path-breaking initiative that researches racially motivated homicides in 12 southern states between 1930 and 70, assesses policy measures to redress ongoing harms from racial terror that took place and houses digital archives. And this work, as you can imagine, is more important than ever. And through fundraising efforts, we have raised approximately $2,500 for the CRRJ. And we ask if anyone wants to contribute, please do. And the information can be provided through you, either through Mielle or on our website, or you can ask me. So thank you for any efforts and contributions you may have to that initiative. And without further ado, I would like to introduce to you our esteemed moderator tonight, Professor Patricia Williams, who has an extensive biography, but I will try to be brief, of all of her accomplishments. At the law school, she is a university distinguished professor of law and humanities. She is a pioneer of both the law and literature and cultural race theory movements in American legal theory, holds a joint appointment between the School of Law and the Department of Philosophy and Religion in the College of Social Sciences and Humanities. She's also a director of law, technology, and ethics initiatives in the School of Law and the College of Social Sciences and Humanities. She's a leading scholar in critical race theory. She has published widely in the areas of race, gender, literature, and law. Her books, including The Alchemy of Race and Rights, illustrate some of America's most complex societal problems and challenge our ideas about socio-legal constructs of race and gender. Her works remain at the cutting edge of legal scholarship, and they are extensive, having published in the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the Washington Post. Professor Williams has held fellowships at the School of Criticism and Theory at Dartmouth, the Humanities Research Institute of the University of California in Irvine, the Institute for Arts and Civic Dialogue at Harvard, the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University, and Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Studies at Harvard. She has previously served as the James L. Dorr Professor of Law at Columbia Law School. She received her bachelor's from Wellesley College and her Juris Doctorate from Harvard University. Her fields of expertise include bioethics, critical race theory, gender, genetics, health law, law and literature, and technology. And we are pleased to have her with us tonight. She is going to start off our discussion. And again, we would welcome questions from all of you. And if you have them, you can put them in the chat, and we can certainly ask Professor Williams to help guide our discussion. So without further ado, Professor Williams,
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you all. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Miel. Thank you to the entire Northeastern Alumni Association and those of you beyond the Alumni Association. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's also such a challenge. I was asked, I believe, before or on the cusp of all going into quarantine and living forever after in Zoom boxes. And therefore, what I was asked to do was to moderate a book club, which sounded cozy. And I imagined a fireplace, and I imagined each of us with a glass of mulled wine in hand. That cannot be, clearly. And so the role of moderator clearly is going to have to be adjusted. And I actually had a dream last night that I was sort of on a tennis court, like Billie Jean King, sort of, you know, with multiple people, or, you know, however many of you, you know, over 100 of you on the other side, casting tennis balls while I try to bat them back into some semblance of conversation. So we will do our best to make it lively, and you know, but I think the technology confines us in some way. So I may do more talking than I had hoped. This will be a conversation which you'll hear the living voices coming out of very few of us, but hopefully the questions will come out of the many of you. I also particularly want to emphasize and underscore how glad I was to see that this event is also a fundraiser for CRRJ. I'm such a tremendous fan of Margaret Burnham's work and of the fact that Northeastern Law School really represents that kind of restorative justice project that is unique and exemplary in American justice and its attempted remediation. And so I hope everybody here will donate generously. That is certainly not only why I am so enthusiastically here, but that particular project is one of the major reasons I came to Northeastern. It is very meaningful. And if the questions that this book raises, if the question of caste, of racism, of class, of gender, of isms across a wide range of genres, is as pressing as we see it manifested in today's political setting, particularly if no other time on January 6th, then it seems to me the kinds of encounters that an uptake, remedial uptake that CRRJ takes is the path perhaps that we need to pursue. Okay, that said, I'm going to give a little time. I'm going to talk just a minute or two in terms of the questions already received. Some people did submit questions, and I thought I would use those questions as a frame to address what I saw as emerging themes and see if that coheres with what others have to offer in the chat box. But the first theme in the questions received had to do about definitions and a certain uncertainty, even confusion about definitions of what is caste. And one of the things that and what is racism? And so I guess one of the things that I wanted to start off with was perhaps some call not to oppositionalize. I think that what Isabel Wilkerson does very well is that she resists certain kinds of oppositionalizing. And I say that as a lawyer, and most of us perhaps here are lawyers, and the way in which we confront problems is, you know, plaintiff versus defendant. And I think that this is not a book in which it's very helpful to think of caste versus race, or caste versus class, or caste versus hierarchy. And I know that many of the reviews, or some of the reviews, have done that. But I think that what she does is almost a kind of Swiss cheese layering, is how I heard. I was on another panel last night and I heard somebody describe language being that way, that there is almost there are holes in each of these in terms of explaining the powerful tenacity of these social systems in freezing us in certain hierarchies. But when one thinks of the intersectionality of a pile of Swiss cheese layers, one gets a sense of the strength that caste is part of it, race is part of it, gender is part of it, and so forth. So resisting oppositions and definitions is one thing. And I think that that's important because the second thing is, if caste has a certain set of definitions that have to do with structure. It's helpful in view of the degree to which racism is so porous. When I teach, I've been teaching the question of how we define racism, and one of its, I think, most baffling attributes is its ineffability. It's a little bit like children use the term cooties. It doesn't always have a firm definition, and it changes over time. It changes from moment to moment, from group to group. It shifts over the decades as well as centuries, but its power is retained. So that ability to shapeshift, to really shapeshift, is part of why it is. I think it's good to think about it as an intersectional force that permits that kind of shapeshifting and resists the kind of essentializing that we so want. We have an affinity, and particularly again as lawyers, for hard definitions, a desire for fixed categories in which there are clear dividing lines. Caste is over here, race is over there, class is different, never the twain shall meet. But I think it's helpful to think, as we search for definition, of something like Venn diagrams, or intersectional, overlapping concepts. The second theme that I drew from the questions thus taken submitted before we began is the question of responsibility. Whose fault is it? The issue of fault comes up over and over again. And again, this is something I would ask us to hold in abeyance for just a moment. That responsibility often involves, I think, a confusion of singulars and plurals. So the question of whiteness becomes taken personally as a personalized identity. That when you talk about whiteness and perhaps some of the evils committed in its name, it's like, but I'm a good person. I'm a good person even though I'm white. And so I think that that's perhaps a confusion between the concept of whiteness in which we all live, whether we're white or black or categorized in all kinds of varieties of ways, as opposed to the power of an insult that is between two individuals. So I think what Isabel Wilkerson is talking about is not just the way in which we insult each other on an individual basis, but the way in which the question of race and the question of caste is embedded in social category, in the atmospherics of a social world, of how we're constituted as polities and as societies. And so to take that, to remove that, even though it's helpful to be able to listen to people's personal experience, that she uses a lot of anecdotes here, but these anecdotes are not really about her, they're illustrating larger empirical statistical realities. And I want to distinguish that from the way in which sometimes anecdotalism is used to exceptionalize. Well, I hear lots of Blacks are suffering, but you're a Black person and you're really well off, and therefore all Black people, it's the sort of faulty syllogism of mixing, again, the singular and the plural. So let's be careful of that. And I think the question of responsibility is often is also a question of genre. We inevitably, I think, each of us, whoever we are in this audience, approach the question of responsibility as inflected by our disciplines. And again, if many of us are lawyers, we want to define it by either a civil fine or who can we put in jail. I mean, that's what we're trained to do. And I want to underscore that Isabel Wilkerson is a journalist. And so what she does is exposit. She describes. And I think that if she were a sociologist, she might be doing something different. If she were an anthropologist, she might approach it from a slightly different approach. And I think this book, if it's not just about law as remediation, we need to listen for how her analysis can help us in law. And her analysis also asks us to explore where injustice is embedded in our very language, in our cultural habits, in how we hold our bodies, the norms we bring into our workplaces, the behavior we model to our children, the flinching we experience when a new neighbor moves in next door and they're not what we think of as beautiful. It's about who or whom we see as beautiful. It's about the 1,000 little ways we feel elevated or diminished by the politeness or disrespect in another's generosity or not. But it's not just about feelings, it's also being out of place. It is the structural, invisible walls around us that mark us as being where we, the sense of you have risen above your place. That's not always written down, but it's very much the subject of dog whistles, whether in race, whether in religious, whether in anti-Semitism. It is a feature, I think, that is shared of the experience of people who are oppressed or subjected in collective ways. Then the final theme that I saw in this was the question of equality. I think in the United States, particularly in the United States, it's written into our collective ideals. The constitutionalism that we hold so dear is about equal access, equal opportunity, treating everybody the same. But obviously we have endless fights about what that precisely means, because everybody is not the same. So is it to bring everybody up to a same sort of comfort level? Is it what does it mean? And so I think that she provokes questions about, are we talking about equality of health? Because we certainly all have very different bodies. Is she talking about equality of wealth? It's certainly not a system in which everybody is expected to have exactly the same coin in their wallets. Is it about equality of stress? Is it about equality of stigma? These require more nuanced responses than as a way of making visible the variety of each of our realities. And so I think that ultimately it is about public accommodation. It is about education, access of opportunity, access to reliable information, so that we can then make individual choices, which may not all be equal, but that grounding in equality of opportunity, equality of in our social world of opportunity, is the point from which we can then depart to argue about what that means. So I think I'll stop here and see if there are arguments with that much.
Well, thank you. We have one of our first chat box questions for you,
okay.
if I may ask.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to read it for you.
Mm-hmm.
One of my questions: why can't castes in the U.S. history we teach kids be updated to make more accurate? To make more accurate would help with how we all see ourselves. As a brown person who has adopted 2 children, one white and one African American, both in elementary school, my son, friends AA, asked me the same questions I had. Where am I in the history?
Mm-hmm. And is the question, where am I in the history? But there was a first question, why can't Caste be updated?
Castes in the U.S. history we teach kids be updated to make more accurate, be more accurate? Would help ourselves, would help with how we all see ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think there's a big definition about what we mean by caste and where am I in this history? I absolutely think that we ought to be much more nuanced in our history, much more accurate in our history. So there are 2 questions, it seems to me. What is it that we are teaching our children? How do children, what is being reflected in what we are teaching? And then there's the much more practical question of why isn't it in our storybooks? Why isn't it in our history books? Why isn't it in our public schools? And as many have observed, we do not have a national system of education. It's state by state. Education and history books in particular is the subject of. We fight about this all the time. We are still fighting to some degree the Civil War, even what to call the Civil War. So the history of race in the country is very contested, and that's reflected in the history books we share with children. And one of the easiest ways of avoiding this, to make it seem like we are all one jolly polity, is to eliminate it, is to eliminate anything that's controversial. And I think that has a cost. I think there have been efforts to do that. The 1619 project that the New York Times and Nicole Hannah, Nicole Hannah Jones so carefully detailed and researched, was met with such, as we know, with such vehement, almost violent pushback that's cited frequently in some of the foment that crested and exploded in the demonstrations of the last few months. We are still arguing over history of whom to memorialize and whom to put in deeper context around the violence of this history. I think that, my own sense is that as long as we are physically as segregated as we are in this country, we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
Because, we have, in reality, one of the most diverse, ethnically, religiously, racially, by any metric, we have the most diverse nation on the planet. And yet we don't know each other. We just don't know each other. And we live in entirely separate worlds. And that's a process, that's a product of racial segregation, wealth segregation, and educational segregation. So I think it's not just what we teach children. It's to look and see who their friends are. It's to provide environments that are rich and diverse, dare I say multilingual, as well as multiracial and multi-ethnic. That's groundwork that I think could be very much helped by policy, very much helped by education. But it's, we are certainly, in terms of the history books for children, a long way away.
Right. So I have a question from Sunu Chandy. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. What does this all mean for affirmative action? I am not sure, Ari, the current day, but no, India has some reservations, quotes, and set-asides, quotes, and thinking of how the few efforts we have there are continuously under attack, etc. Curious, Ari, policy proposals that all flow from all of this repeated documentation of harms.
Yeah, it's I think we face obviously the same thing in the United States. There have, litigation after litigation to be included. The entire history of the post-Reconstruction period from the Civil War onward has been inclusion to education, inclusion in the question of public accommodation. That has been the majority of constitutional jurisprudence since that time, whether we learn it even in law schools or not. And the pushback to that in the last 2 decades in particular, the pushback against that. What in Britain is called positive discrimination, what is called set-asides or reservations in other countries such as India have been under attack. There have been alternative schemes devised. In the United States, I think it is the push to have reparations, to align it with more recent victimizations such as the Japanese removal or victims of the Holocaust, reparations payment to the descendants or the family or the direct victims of certain kinds of things. It becomes much more difficult when you have generations separating, for example, slavery. But it seems to me that reparations is one way to express it, but that's what affirmative action was for.
Right.
Affirmative action is a kind of distributive justice. If we can't identify with any particularity, names were changed. People sold on the road. We don't know who is whose relative or on what, all of those records are to some extent, they're lost in terms of where we came from and what particular losses we suffered. And therefore, in the modern world, it seems to me that one effective possibility is a kind of affirmative action that distributes public accommodations and public access according to the probabilities of social situation and position resulting from not just the history but the present case of segregation.
Yeah. Professor Joseph Reynolds, thanks you for being here, first of all.
Thank you.
But also has a question for you. He's so glad to hear that you're addressing the levels of language and then you have expertise in bioethics. His question, well, I'll start before the question. Wilkerson makes mention of the fact that race is a construct, ... that everyone's genomes are 99% the same, and it is caste, not race, that is the division bell. So how do we transmute language? If we continue to label in a binary...
Could you back up just a moment, that it is caste?
Caste, comma, not race, that is the division bell.
The division bell?
B-E-L, bell, the division bell. So how do we transmute language? If we continue to label in a binary, said might say, do we perpetuate the potential for marginalization? Is genomics the opportunity to start to erase the borders of race?
That's why I stopped you around caste, but not race. I didn't hear, and I don't read Isabel Wilkerson at all as saying that.
Okay.
I don't, and that's, I would resist again her analysis is an oppositional one. She says that caste explains some of the immovability, but I don't think she says that. In fact, if I look for those, because I know that this will come up again, many people that I also talked about, this either or-ism. I did not hear her putting it as a binary category. In fact, on page 72, she says race and caste are not the cause and do not account for every poor outcome or unpleasant encounter. But caste becomes a factor to whatever infinitesimal degree in interactions and decisions across gender, ethnicity, race, immigrant status, sexual orientation, age, or religion that have consequences in our everyday lives and in policies that affect our country and beyond. So I think she really does position it as quite intersectional with all these other forces. So that's the first thing that I would say. The question of whether simply because we are all human beings and that recognition, if only it were as simple as saying, look, Francis Collins says, she points to Francis Collins stating that back when the human genome was first mapped, Bill Clinton had high hopes. We are all one people, kumbaya. That has not happened. January 6th proved. In fact, people are using the slight definitions that really go to really irrelevant things that do have nothing to do with our brain power or disposition or our attractions or our capacity to do anything. Some people are drinking milk based on the fact that they supposedly have connections to something that they can label Aryan. These are geographic distributions. They have nothing to do with capacities, inherent or otherwise. And so I think that the degree to which we are all human as absolutely incontrovertible,
right,
as a biological factor, which again does not understate the fact that some of us have some capacity, some do not, but it is not understandable. It's not divisible by race. Race is incoherent in terms of genetics. We can divide each other by haplotype groups or, ability to, withstand sunlight to some degree, having to do with melanin, but melanin has nothing to do with brain power. There's no coherence in mapping race to the categories, the social categories that we assign them in the United States and other kinds of isms. Mm-hmm. So that said, the idea that, that we're just going to get over it, I think that, look what we've done with the entire human susceptibility to COVID-19. Mm-hmm. If there were any potential for seeing our mutual humanity, this would be the setting. We are all as vulnerable to this virus as, there is no racial distinction. And if that hasn't proved our common humanity, nothing will. Right. And I think that really is testament not to our to different biological capacities. There's no evidence of that. What it is evidence is is the power of the segregative instincts that we have and the inability to recognize that proximity, for example, or unemployment or lack of access to health care makes huge differences for us. It has never been on such display, but the resistance to that, I think, is something we really have to ask ourselves. And
Right.
again, this is not about fault, it's not about feeling, this is about the structures around us. And that's why I think it's helpful to think of it not simply as, oh, well, if I can just see that it's not about my genetics, then that will change everything. These are quite deep structures, and that I think that the analysis of caste, the analogy of caste, the metaphor of caste, if one will, is helpful in understanding the cementedness of the segmentation, even where, the definition of race may change or shift.
I have a similar themed question from Ingrid Nava. She writes, I appreciate the idea that the book is written by a journalist, and thus it is try to paint a picture of what we might not always see, and that has intrinsic value. I did find the book valuable for that reason, but it does seem that the book is being billed as more accurate explanation of our social structures than other explanations, including racism. If it is more of a Swiss cheese layer or a Venn diagram circle, what are the unique insights it lends to potential solutions going forward, in your view?
It's first of all, I would love to know more of where, I mean, I can't account for the way in which some have perceived this book. And so I think if the question is about how others have reviewed it or how some might see it as being an explanation only of caste as opposed to the intersection, I just read it differently. Let's put it that way.
Got it.
But what I think that caste provides and adds to the analysis is, again, a sense of intersectionality with the way in which social segmentation can be resisted or understood as something which doesn't allow movement. And I think that what is essential in racial understanding in the United States at this moment in time, and for the last century perhaps, is a sense of race as fairly, as something which can be overcome with a certain kind of attitude, and that it's a choice to be racist or not racist. And there's a way in which racism and racial understanding is so mired in analyses that if we just don't use certain words, or if we greet each other in a more friendly fashion, or if we hire 2 or 3 more, then this will shift the very nature of racism. That has, over time, been met with arguments that, no, we're really not talking about, racism is not an individual choice, that racism is structural. And so you have these arguments about structure and race as structure. But I think even that has been, to some extent, understood only within the structure of color, of colorism, of the history of slavery. There are those who bring a class analysis, racial capitalism, to the table. And I think that's also very helpful. Again, I think that class analysis frequently is met with the same kind of isolationism that caste and then race over here and class is only about class. Or, but I actually think it helps to have a class analysis. But caste, race, class, some of the features of anti-Semitism, for example. One of the critiques I read recently of what we need to be aware of is that, yes, color and race have been fixed, were really fixed starting in the 1600s, perhaps. But we can go back farther than that to talk about the Irish, to talk about the breeding of animals, to talk about how Jews in Europe were put beyond the pale. And this wasn't always just a matter of racial capitalism. But nevertheless, it played upon feature, it hybridized over time, took, when the Nazis blossomed forth with their version of Kristallnacht, or our, they borrowed the American eugenics movement. They placed it atop the history and the slow history of slow violence against Jews in Europe that went all the way back to mythological tales of horns and tails.
So, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
We have so many good questions. I just want to get to a few more.
Go ahead.
We have 20 minutes left. And
so I think the hybridization is something that I would, So I think that she is more hybridized than the characterization of her.
So Bijou Bahari writes, grief and loss, one of the many themes in this book. Do you have any suggestions in healing social trauma?
I wish I did. And I guess that would I am hardly an expert in the history of trauma, but I do think that to the extent individual stories blend with social psychology, and social psychology blends into the social constructs of race and anti-Semitism and name it group. I think that trauma, I remember the psychoanalytic definition of trauma is an injury so deep that it either bypasses the language center or it enters the body so deeply that you have no words to express it. And therefore, one of the treatments for trauma is to find some way to expressive modes. Otherwise, it gets reenacted because you don't have a sense of words. You reenact it and you reenact it and you reenact it. And I wonder about the way in which, when I look at what happened on January 6th, if what I wasn't looking at was what Kathleen Bellew's wonderful book on called Bring Home the War, which is about the resurgent nature of racial riots, that this is about reenacted trauma. And so I look to, how do we heal trauma? How do we heal post-traumatic stress syndrome? We are such a violent country. And so it seems to me that we need to look at the arts and psychoanalytic theory for how we can find better ways of performing how we've been injured. Because what we're watching is a kind of performance that escapes words, that violence is a kind of behavior that clearly our best words don't address.
Understood. Sabrina T. Writes, so long as people have an implicit / explicit bias against words like caste, in quotes, associating them with a specific race and possibly exoticizing the word, will it ever be possible to shift the use of language and direct it towards caste?
Well, I'm not sure. There are two aspects of that. I mean, I'm not sure that it's entirely useful simply to move away from one category and treat caste as an entirely separate category. Again, I see caste as helping us in the overall deeply complex, multi-pronged set of constraints, a set of social and political constraints. So I think that it's the question of exoticized words is a little bit different. I do think that words are slippery, and there's a way in which we, that part of our problem is precisely exoticizing. Well, caste explains everything, or let's invent a new term like biracial, or let's invent a word like multiculturalism. And I think part of the resistance, the underlying resistance, is a semantic one. And so we end up with pushback in which I'm going to call this racism. And then somebody says, well, no, that's reverse racism. And as reverse racism, I become the victim. So we play this round and round and round. And that's what I mean, words escape us, in which, multiculturalism becomes the equivalent of monoculturalism. If you recall, during the culture wars, multiculturalism meant let's do something intersectional, recognize we all have many cultures and we'll celebrate them. And it became attacked as tribalism and groupthink. And at the end, it was extruded as, as monoculturalism. So language is very slippery. And I think that's one of the concerns I have about our treatment of race and our discussions of race, that they become, that race itself is so ineffable and it keeps changing its definitions. It's, again, I go back to the cooties analogy. It doesn't have a firm definition. It keeps escaping us. And so I think renewing the vocabulary all the time is a constant moral challenge. It's what we have to do. If caste helps us understand a little bit of a dimension that was invisible, that's wonderful. I don't think caste is going to replace or displace the basic problem, though. So I think whatever vocabulary vitalizes, but you're right, if it's exoticized, let's look at what are the metrics of exoticizing. And I think that is really, you know, exoticizing romanticizes the exceptional, as opposed to understanding the plural, compounded, multiple nature of these bottom line issues.
Yeah, a similar themed question from Ellen Davis is, if caste is an immovable construct, isn't it better to stick with racism?
I don't think that helps with the immovability. You know, if I think she described it at one point as being analogous to the cast one gets on a broken arm, for example. The goal is not to simply use caste to further cement social relations, but to recognize a structure that is, as she puts it, like an armature, like an invisible architecture, steel, you know, a frame for what we are moving within. It needs to be recognized for what it is. We need to see what isn't moving. And if caste helps us see that, then it seems to me that that's not giving over to the permanence of caste just because it talks about permanence. That's to sort of misconstrue what's being referred to.
Right. Right. So as you know, we had a bunch of questions before this evening, and I think that you would sort of addressed many of them in some themes. I'm going to refer to some of those specific questions. You may have touched upon some of these themes a little bit in your presentation, but I'm going to be a little more direct. One of the questions we had from the audience before tonight was, some argue that the concept of caste, in quotes, explains a lot, but not enough to capture the political dynamism, embedded structure in social meaning of race. Do you have a take on this, especially from the nexus of law and politics?
I think that speaks exactly to why I think, and I think at various points in the book, Wilkerson does recognize that you have to, that both offer parts of an explanation. What the writer of that question referred to as dynamism is what I might have been referring to as the malleability of the definition of race. But putting them together helps one see, for example, how we keep reinventing the same thing over and over within categories of race. There's a wonderful legal historian named Ariella Gross. I highly recommend her books as well. And she talks about the fact that at this moment in history, we think of race as black, white, or white, not black. I mean, but even that category shifts to who we mean, to whom we're referring. But that 100 years ago, we had, from colonial times until sometime well into the times of slavery, there were color codes, so that we had octoroon and quadroon and levels of recognition of racial division that have metastasized into colorism generally in not just this country, but around the world. But that each of those might have had different levels of social accessibility, rights. There's a wonderful work of Martha Jones's book on birthright citizenship, talks about other kinds of inflections of race, the distinctions between those who were slaves and those who were freed. Freed Black people did not have all the rights of white freed people. And so this history, is a complex one. Sometimes, is Michael Jordan in the same social category or Oprah Winfrey in today's world? Because certainly class has a great deal to do with this, but both of those people, when they are not recognized, receive treatment that demonizes and dehumanizes. So as we walk in and out of the boxes of category, those boxes haven't changed, even though if we can frame ourselves as an extremely wealthy person, we might escape some of that. But it's the underlying boxes, the construct of boxes that she's concerned with in this book. That does not eliminate our concern about the like the flash fire of how race is defined, and it may be different here and over here, but it's still, it's clearly race. And so it seems to me these things are working together. So
similarly themed question from Linda White. So do you think that the racial / caste lines are blurred?
Yes. And she certainly says that. That's why I really recommend for those who are trying to put these two things together, I think she really puts between about, I think it's like page 68 to 72, she talks a little bit about that. And she also ends with this sense of, the lines are absolutely blurred. And again, I take her meaning to help us figure out what is it about place in a society that's inescapable, that's permanent, that we can't, that keeps dogging us, as opposed to that which is also confining, but keeps changing and keeps shifting. And the shifting language frequently, I think, is located in our discourse of race. And I think the impermeability of it is frequently invisible and is located in some of what one can find in analyses of caste. This does not mean that our caste system is the same as India's, or that India's is the same as the Third Reich. But
No, I was just going to, one of the questions that was submitted by one of our earlier readers asks you to please address how both recent rhetoric and treatment of undocumented immigrants fits into the caste structure discussed in the book.
I think that there is so much to say about the still evolving structure of how we are treating migrants, and particularly in the last 4 years. But it's so incoherent, it's so all over the place. So let me just talk about the language that has frozen the status of migrants, either both the anti-Muslim discourse on the one hand and anti-migrants from Latin America on the other hand. And one is the shifting discourse of my people, my people. Donald Trump kept, from his very first bid for president, kept talking about my people, they love me so much. And he started creating an alternate political construct, a world in which some were his people and some were not. But in that, he created an alternate world with which some could identify and some couldn't. And it was new. If you recall, in the United States, not Great Britain, but in the United States, Muslims up until 9/11 really were viewed as fairly well off, sort of model minorities. They were fairly well-to-do and fairly well-educated in the United States as a category. that turned upside down by the slow narrowing and recategorization as terrorists. We've had the same slow violence with the Statue of Liberty. It's no longer give me your huddled masses. It is, make your own way, pay your own way, or turn away at the border. This is a shifting discourse that appeals to the lines of segregation, which weren't asserted against these categories, but nevertheless feel familiar to certain people who rise to the sentence that isn't quite finished.
Right.
And we fill in the blank. And so it is a little bit like, what is it, Mad Libs? We fill in the blank. And the Mad Libs are the caste system into which we slot the new minorities or the new categories of racial opprobrium. But the fluidity is the very nature of what we do with racism in the United States. The fluidity and the plasticity of these new categories is a defining feature of racism.
Professor, I do want to ask you a question that came from Diana Ain Schenker. Can you speak to the value of global perspectives in understanding caste in US and the particularity of American racism in offering lessons globally?
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously the use of the American eugenics movement in the Nazi castes, in the anti-Semitic system, is an example of how these prejudices and hierarchies bleed one into the other. The use of, we talk about the American system of slavery and racism, but it's really also a product of global colonialism, of Britain and Spain and France's and Belgium's, for heaven's sake, colonial metrics of who could participate and who couldn't, and what features were favored more the colonial masters as opposed to those who didn't. How the structures of geography were divided up on plantations and then in segregated territories throughout Latin America and the Americas. And these have had global significance, and they will continue to have global significance because we're building them into algorithms. We are taking these to the exoskeletons of how we are organizing ourselves in terms of risk predictors, not just in medicine, but in who can live where, in terms of, so we're burying these status markers into our algorithmic identities. And I think we're at a very, very precarious moment for re-inscribing these kinds of prejudices, and it's going to eliminate our sense of ourselves as mobile creatures within, particularly which is another American ideal. We are not a system, we have not identified ourselves except as to racism with the more the greater vocabulary for class place that one has in Europe.
Right. Professor, can you please give our audience a little bit of a summary about your thoughts about the book before we end tonight?
My thoughts about the book. I think the resonance of this book across such a wide audience is something that we should really value for its persuasive power. I think if one is an academic, one may want a particular kind of analysis that had more charts or more, that distinguished and spent more time with things like class and the sociology of race, or that looked more like an Orlando Patterson book on slavery, or maybe there could be said more about memory. But I think that in terms of translating the theories and the anthropology and the sociology of race and the history of caste for a broad audience in a trade book, I think that this really is helpful in allowing us to feel what's at stake, to make us less of mimes where you feel these invisible walls, but you don't quite know how to provide a word for it. And I think she provides some vocabulary or the beginnings of discussions for that. It doesn't resolve everything. So I think that the value of the book is enlarging our sense of what's at stake and enlarging our sense beyond the incredibly futile and endless discussions of, but I'm a good person, therefore I'm not racist.
Right.
Or, why don't you just stop complaining and, to talk about race is to bring race into being.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it gives us a richer vocabulary that's less freighted with the animosity and emotions of feeling at fault. We just have to get past that. Bring lots of Kleenex, but let's talk about this. Let's deal with this. But we can't keep going in circles. And that's what I thought she expanded. Yeah. She gave us an opening. She doesn't resolve everything, but she gives us an opening.
Do you have any book recommendations for us? Maybe for our next virtual book club?
I have a book coming out in March, which looks at the long history of the language, the discourse of Gone with the Wind, which is such a romantic vision of slavery, which I think is part of our problem. I also, as I mentioned, I really like Ariella Gross's analysis in a book called Double Character. It's an older book, but it's a wonderful book about the history of how we categorize race in the United States. Martha Jones' Birthright Citizenship that I mentioned before. There is where am I blanking out on this? Forgive me. My colleague in the philosophy department, Sabrina Parek's book on No Refuge, which is about the status of refuge. It's also about race, but it's about the status of global refugees. And I think it takes some of these analyses and puts them in the global context, which we desperately need to do. We need to stop thinking about this particular construct as simply an American, it's most powerfully an American problem, but we need to think about how we are exporting it, but also how we're importing. And I think her book does that beautifully. I'm happy to provide a bibliography. My bibliography will be endless. Jill Stauffer's book called Ethical Loneliness, which is about both race and the history of refugee isolation and our failure to be empathetic to those whom we've turned our backs on. And then finally, I would recommend Colin Diane's book, The Law is a White Dog, which is a wonderful, funny, and really, really sophisticated book about race and its both hypervisibility and invisibility, its simultaneous hypervisibility and invisibility.
Great. Well, thank you. I want to thank you so much again for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Do we have an opportunity to have everybody clap and applaud Professor Williams? Or
I think everybody, can you unmute yourself? Is that possible?
Thank you.
A big round of applause for Professor Williams, Michael, Lee. Really appreciate everyone joining us tonight. Loved the discussion. And we will make this, we recorded this and we will make it available on the book club page. We'll send out something in a few days, next week probably. We also hope to capture the chat. Again, we really appreciate everyone's time. Professor Williams, you are phenomenal. Michael, you did a fantastic job. Lee as well. Great job.
Thank you, Miel.
For joining us. Thank you for coming from all over the United States and actually beyond. So really, really appreciate that. We had a great turnout. Professor Williams.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.